Assault weapons are a huge problem in the United States, debunking the myth. The term assault weapon is often used by gun control advocates to describe semi-automatic rifles, like the AR-15 and AK-47. These rifles have become the focal point of intense debate, with some groups like Everytown pushing the narrative that they are responsible for a significant portion of mass shootings and overall gun violence. However, when you take a closer look at the data, the argument that assault weapons are a major problem begins to fall apart. Mass shootings and assault rifles. Everytown claims that a study of mass shooting incidents between 1981 and 2017 found that assault rifles accounted for 86% of the 501 fatalities reported in 44 mass shooting incidents. At first glance, this statistic might seem alarming, but let's break it down. 86% of 501 deaths over 36 years is approximately 430 fatalities, which averages out to about 12 deaths per year. While every death is tragic, this number pales in comparison to the leading causes of death in the United States. For perspective, furniture. More people die each year from furniture-related accidents, such as falling TVs. Coconuts. About 150 people die annually from falling coconuts. Icicles. Approximately 15 people die from falling icicles. Constipation. Constipation leads to about 900 deaths per year. In 2020 alone, more people died from putting foreign objects in their anus, 287 deaths, than have been killed by an AR-15 in the last 5 years. Despite the focus on AR-15s in the media, the data shows that the actual number of fatalities caused by these rifles is relatively low when compared to other causes of accidental death. The prevalence of AR-15s and similar rifles. The AR-15 platform is one of the most popular firearms in the United States, known for its reliability, ease of use, and versatility. According to ATF data, production of AR-15s more than doubled between 2007 and 2016, increasing from 1.6 million to 4.2 million. Despite the proliferation of these firearms, their involvement in violent crime remains rare. If AR-15s and other semi-automatic rifles were as dangerous as gun control advocates claim, we would expect to see a much higher number of deaths associated with their use. However, even in mass shootings, these rifles are not the primary weapons used. The vast majority of gun deaths, both in homicides and suicides, are committed with handguns, not rifles. The FBI's data on rifles. One of the most telling pieces of evidence against the idea that AR-15s are a significant problem is the FBI's crime data. The FBI does not specifically track assault rifles as a category. Instead, it groups all rifles together. Even with this broader category, rifles are involved in far fewer homicides than other weapons. Rifles, all types. In 2020, rifles were used in only 454 homicides. Knives or cutting instruments, 1,732 homicides. Blunt objects, like hammers, 393 homicides. Personal weapons, hands, fists, feet, etc., 662 homicides. These numbers demonstrate that rifles, including AR-15s, are far less likely to be used in violent crime compared to other weapons. In fact, you are more likely to be killed by a knife, a blunt object, or even someone's bare hands than by a rifle. The ineffectiveness of assault weapon bans. The argument for banning so-called assault weapons is often based on the assumption that doing so would reduce gun violence. However, the evidence does not support this conclusion. For example, during the 10-year period when the federal assault weapons ban, AWB, was in effect, 1994 to 2004, multiple studies, including those commissioned by the Department of Justice, found no clear impact on gun violence. Moreover, mass shootings continued to occur during the AWB, and many of the weapons used were not covered by the ban. The AWB was primarily focused on cosmetic features, such as pistol grips, folding stocks, and flash suppressors, which have little to no effect on a firearm's lethality. Gun buybacks, the illogical approach to gun control. Gun buyback programs are frequently touted as a solution to gun violence, often organized by local governments, police departments, or community organizations. They aim to reduce the number of firearms in circulation by offering cash or incentives for people to voluntarily surrender their weapons, no questions asked. However, the logic behind these programs is flawed, and the results have consistently proven ineffective in reducing gun violence. The reality of gun buybacks. One fundamental issue with gun buyback programs is the misleading notion that the government or police can buy back something they never owned. The term buyback is a misnomer. These programs are simply voluntary exchanges where people turn in firearms, often at a fraction of their actual value. There are two main types of participants in gun buybacks: well-meaning citizens. These are often law-abiding individuals who have no intention of using their firearms for criminal purposes. Many turn in old, unused, or inherited guns, mistakenly believing that by participating, they are making their communities safer. However, these firearms were never likely to be used in a crime in the first place. Criminals laundering stolen guns. The no questions asked policy provides an opportunity for criminals to launder stolen firearms. Instead of risking arrest by selling stolen guns on the black market or to a pawn shop, they can hand them over to the police in exchange for cash or gift cards with zero risk. This effectively turns gun buybacks into fencing operations for stolen goods, further encouraging crime. The ineffectiveness of gun buybacks. Multiple studies have shown that gun buyback programs do not reduce gun violence. A 2004 review by the National Academy of Sciences concluded that gun buybacks are ineffective as generally implemented because they do not target the firearms most likely to be used in crimes. A 2013 study by the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Policy and Research found no evidence that gun buyback programs reduce gun crime or gun-related injuries. The study emphasized that buybacks tend to attract low-risk firearms that are less likely to be involved in criminal activity. The reasons for the ineffectiveness of gun buybacks are clear. Low participation by criminals. Criminals who rely on guns to commit crimes are unlikely to surrender their weapons voluntarily. The firearms turned in are often old, broken, or obsolete, posing little threat to public safety. Reselling the guns. In some states, the law requires that guns collected through buybacks be resold to gun dealers or through auction houses rather than being destroyed. This means that many of the firearms surrendered in buybacks eventually find their way back into circulation, defeating the purpose of the program. No impact on the black market. Gun buybacks do nothing to address the illegal firearms market, where criminals are more likely to obtain their weapons. Even if a large number of guns are surrendered, the black market will continue to supply criminals with firearms. In fact, the reduced supply of guns due to buybacks could lead to higher black market prices, further incentivizing gun theft and trafficking. The cost of a national buyback. One major problem often overlooked is the cost of a large-scale national buyback program targeting so-called assault weapons, like the AR-15. Estimates suggest there are around 20 million AR-15s currently in circulation in the United States. This figure does not even include other firearms that fall under the nebulous assault weapon category. If the government were to attempt a national buyback, the cost would be astronomical. Consider a conservative estimate where the government offers $1,000 per AR-15 in a buyback program. The price tag would exceed $20 billion just for AR-15s alone. This doesn't account for administrative costs, law enforcement, or the vast number of other assault weapons also in circulation. The financial burden would be massive, and there's no guarantee that criminals would even participate. Instead, law-abiding citizens would be the primary participants, leading to an expensive program that disarms those least likely to commit crimes while doing little to impact actual gun violence. Case study, Australia. Gun control advocates often point to Australia's 1996 mandatory gun buyback program, which was implemented after the Port Arthur mass shooting. The government bought back and destroyed around 650,000 firearms, approximately 20% of the nation's total at the time. However, the success of Australia's buyback is debatable. Violent crime trends. While gun homicides declined after the buyback, Non-gun homicides did not see a similar decrease. Furthermore, the decline in gun homicides had already begun before the buyback was implemented, suggesting that other factors were at play. Gun ownership. Despite the buyback, gun ownership in Australia has steadily increased since 1997. By 2016, there were more firearms in private hands than before the buyback, indicating that the long-term impact on gun availability was minimal. The illogical premise of gun buybacks. The core problem with gun buybacks is the flawed assumption that reducing the number of guns in circulation will automatically lead to a reduction in gun violence. This logic ignores several key factors. Criminal behavior. Gun violence is driven by criminal intent, not the mere presence of firearms. Criminals intent on committing violence will continue to obtain guns through illegal means, regardless of gun buybacks. Black market dynamics. Gun buybacks do nothing to address the supply and demand dynamics of the illegal firearms market. The demand for guns among criminals remains unchanged, ensuring that firearms will continue to flow through illegal channels. False sense of security. Gun buybacks can create a false sense of security in communities, leading people to believe that streets are safer simply because guns were turned in. In reality, the guns most likely to be used in crimes are still out there, and the people most likely to commit violence are not participating in the buyback. Conclusion. Gun buybacks are ineffective at reducing gun violence. They primarily disarm law-abiding citizens, create opportunities for criminals to launder stolen firearms, and do nothing to address the black market for guns. The cost of a national buyback targeting so-called assault weapons would be astronomical, with little impact on reducing violent crime. Real solutions should focus on addressing the root causes of violence, such as poverty, gang activity, and mental health issues, rather than relying on buybacks that provide a false sense of security and do little to make communities safer. Top of form. Bottom of form. Nobody needs an AR-15.
Necessity is the plea for every infringement of human freedom. It is the argument of tyrants. It is the creed of slaves.
William Pitt the Younger. A common argument from gun control advocates is that nobody needs an AR-15 or similar assault weapons. The idea is that these firearms are too powerful for civilian use and are unnecessary for self-defense or sporting purposes. However, the notion of need is subjective, and what someone determines they need is not for others to dictate, as long as they aren't hurting anyone. The AR-15, AK-47, and similar platforms were designed for their effectiveness in terms of power, accuracy, and ease of control. These are precisely the reasons they are popular with civilians, military personnel, and law enforcement alike. Why you might need an AR-15. One of the key arguments for owning an AR-15 or similar firearm is self-reliance. If law enforcement deems these firearms necessary for their protection, why wouldn't civilians have a need for them as well? The threats police officers face could very well be the same threats a civilian might encounter, whether in rural areas, during periods of civil unrest, or when facing multiple attackers. Even beyond the potential for self-defense, AR-15s serve various roles in civilian life. Sport shooting and hunting. The versatility and precision of AR-15s make them popular for target shooting and hunting. Hunters often choose AR-15s chambered in calibers suited for everything, from small game to larger predators. Disaster preparedness. In situations of natural disaster or societal breakdown, as witnessed during the COVID-19 pandemic, a semi-automatic rifle with a higher capacity may provide the peace of mind that less powerful firearms cannot. In March 2020, during the initial panic over COVID-19, Americans purchased 3.7 million firearms, the most on record. Many of these buyers were first-time gun owners who quickly realized the importance of being prepared for emergencies. Home defense. When facing a threat in your home, a firearm like an AR-15 can offer the accuracy, ease of use, and firepower necessary to protect yourself and your family from multiple assailants or a determined intruder. The double standard, Ukraine and civilian firearms. During the early stages of the 2022 Russia-Ukraine conflict, the same anti-gun politicians and activists in the U.S. who regularly argue against civilian firearm ownership were suddenly praising Ukrainian citizens for taking up arms against Russian invaders. For example, pages like Occupy Democrats, which are staunchly anti-gun, were applauding the courage of Ukrainian civilians as they armed themselves with assault weapons to defend their homeland. Some ASDM figures even supported gun buybacks in the U.S., with the idea that the collected firearms could be sent to Ukraine to arm civilians against the Russian military. The irony of this position should be apparent. The very firearms that are demonized and considered unnecessary for American civilians were hailed as essential tools of freedom and resistance for Ukrainians. The cognitive dissonance in this scenario highlights the flawed logic of gun control advocates who argue that civilians don't need these weapons. In times of crisis, whether it's a foreign invasion, civil unrest, or a natural disaster, the need for effective self-defense becomes glaringly obvious. The idea that what works for Ukrainians under attack isn't relevant to American civilians under potential threat is a blatant contradiction. Over 20 million AR-15s in circulation. The AR-15 is one of the most popular firearms in the United States, with an estimated 20 million in circulation. This figure doesn't even include other so-called assault rifles. The sheer number of these firearms in the hands of law-abiding Americans demonstrates their widespread use and value. A national gun buyback targeting AR-15s would not only be an astronomical financial burden, but it would also be ineffective in reducing crime, given that these firearms are rarely used in mass shootings or other crimes compared to handguns and other weapons. The logic of need and self-defense. The concept of need in the context of firearm ownership is often framed in a way that undermines personal responsibility and self-reliance. We do not question the need for cars that can travel over 100 miles per hour, or for homes that are larger than what is strictly necessary for shelter. The same logic applies to firearms. Just because someone else doesn't see a need for an AR-15 doesn't mean that others should be prevented from owning one. Additionally, when panic strikes, perceptions of need can change rapidly. As mentioned, during the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, many people who had previously opposed gun ownership became first-time buyers. When faced with uncertainty and fear, the idea of self-reliance suddenly made sense to many who had previously trusted the government to take care of them. Ultimately, the question of what people need is subjective. The right to own firearms, including AR-15s, is protected by the Second Amendment, and any attempt to limit this right based on arbitrary definitions of necessity is both unconstitutional and illogical. The best person to determine what someone needs for self-defense is the individual themselves, not the government, and certainly not politicians with an anti-gun agenda. Real men don't need guns or compensating for penis size. The argument that real men don't need guns or that gun owners are compensating for penis size is a common yet absurd attempt to shame people for exercising their right to self-defense. Interestingly, this type of rhetoric often comes from the same group that claims to be against toxic masculinity and in favor of inclusivity. Yet they deploy these tactics that hinge on traditional gender stereotypes and toxic assumptions about masculinity. Self-defense is not dependent on sex. First and foremost, self-defense is not reserved for men. The idea that gun ownership or the desire for personal protection is somehow linked to masculinity or compensating for insecurity ignores the fact that millions of women own and use firearms for protection. In fact, the fastest growing group of gun owners in the United States is women. Firearms are the great equalizer for those who may be physically smaller, weaker, or outnumbered in a dangerous situation. Saying that real men don't need guns implies that women don't have a right to defend themselves either. This undermines the entire purpose of self-defense, which is to ensure personal safety regardless of physical strength, sex, or size. Responsible people, regardless of their sex, choose to defend themselves and their loved ones by whatever means they feel necessary. It's a fundamental human right, not a measure of one's masculinity. The compensating argument, purely juvenile. As for the notion that gun ownership is compensating for something, this is nothing more than a juvenile insult that doesn't deserve a serious response. The compensation argument is a shallow attempt to shame gun owners into feeling insecure about their decision to protect themselves and their families. It ignores the fact that the vast majority of gun owners are law-abiding citizens who understand the responsibility that comes with owning a firearm. To trivialize that responsibility by reducing it to a joke about penis size is not only disrespectful, but also highlights the lack of seriousness with which gun control advocates approach the issue of personal safety. Moreover, if gun ownership is merely compensating for insecurity, then does this argument also apply to police officers, military personnel, and bodyguards who carry firearms as part of their job? Clearly, this line of reasoning falls apart when applied to reality. Guns are tools, not symbols of insecurity. Firearms are tools, and like any tool, they are used for a specific purpose. A person who owns a gun isn't trying to make a statement about their manhood or their worth. They are simply taking precautions to protect themselves and their loved ones in a dangerous world. The idea that carrying a gun is somehow a sign of weakness or insecurity ignores the reality that firearms are often used by people who are keenly aware of the risks they face and who want to be prepared to defend themselves. Urban Dictionary humorously defines the term "dick in your hand" as someone stuck in a predicament without the right tools. And in a real-life self-defense situation, being unarmed would certainly leave you unprepared, whether you are a man, woman, or anyone else. The hypocrisy of the argument. It's also worth noting the hypocrisy behind this argument. The same people who mock gun owners for compensating are often the ones advocating for policies that leave people defenseless. They argue that the government, police, or some other external force will protect you in times of danger. Yet the same people who make these arguments often critique law enforcement and call for defunding the police. The contradiction here is glaring. If the police cannot always be trusted to protect you, and you are discouraged from protecting yourself, then who is left to ensure your safety? Real courage. Taking responsibility for your safety. The truth is, real courage comes from taking responsibility for your own safety and the safety of those around you. It takes maturity and foresight to acknowledge that bad things can happen and to prepare for those situations, rather than relying on someone else to come to your rescue. Gun owners understand that they are their first line of defense, and they take that responsibility seriously. There is nothing insecure or compensatory about that. The bottom line is that comments like "real men don't need guns" or "compensating for something" are nothing more than childish taunts designed to belittle responsible gun owners. They ignore the real-world reasons people choose to arm themselves and demonstrate a lack of understanding of the basic principles of self-defense. Instead of engaging in immature name-calling, it would be more productive for gun control advocates to recognize the importance of personal safety and the role firearms play in ensuring that safety for millions of Americans.